Peace, family. This is Dave Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're doing something a little different, on our platforms or political commentary, Corner Lawrence Grand Prix, our political commentator, and some of the appearances that I make on In Search of Black Power. We're talking about like really specific issues of policy, our larger political analysis. And as we as an organization begin to be more directly engaged in the electoral side of the work. We want to bring to our audience people that we feel, a general sense of alignment with, folks who we've seen and observed over the years. That's people that are champions for our people, as folks who are advancing, policies and proposals that have Black people at the center. And so this is a conversation with, a friend and colleague, Quiana Johnson. I'm going to let Sister Quiana introduce herself. Tell the people about yourself, Quiana.
Hello, and good morning. Thank you so much, Davon, for having me be a part of the conversation this morning. My name is Quiana Johnson, and I am the founder and executive director of Life After Release. I am also a co-conductor at Harriet's Wildest Dreams and a proud member of the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, as well as the Movement for Black Lives. I'm also a mother of two sons, a graduate of the University of Maryland University College, and I'm also a candidate for Clerk of the Circuit Court of Prince George's County.
So appreciate you for being with us. And, we're going to really focus on that last piece that you mentioned, your candidacy for clerk of the court in Prince George's County. So that's kind of what we're going to land and, just have some conversation about, how you in that seat would be impactful for Black people. You know what LBS is about, right? You know our perspective and worldview, right? And so really what we want to do is provide our listeners just with some information about you through the lens of the worldview and perspective that we operate from. So as the perspective of LBS is based on the notion that this society is structured on racism and white supremacy, that this society is a settler colony, and that analysis is very different than what you get in the political mainstream, right? In fact, there's some people that will describe that perspective as extreme or fringe. Um, we think it's an essential part of our worldview, right? Because it's the reality of what our community, it's reality of our community. So with that being said, how does your organization, your work, um, overlap with that perspective? How much of the perspective that the society is structured on racism and white supremacy, and that America is a settler colony, how much of that overlaps with your worldview and perspective that you've operated off of?
That's a very good question, Davon. And actually, it is what basically shaped my work. When I came home from prison, I actually started my organization. But before I actually got home and started doing the work of my organization, I had these big dreams while I was incarcerated. And these dreams were about, coming home and getting individuals a job. Right. I thought that because I went to prison, I was college educated, I worked for the federal government. I thought that, surely formerly incarcerated people or people that are incarcerated just needed a leg up. They just needed a job. And I came home and I started my organization as a resume clinic. It wasn't until I became politicized, right, working with an organization, Progressive Maryland, and then going into mass liberation, and getting trained and understanding. And I'm not ashamed anymore, but I used to be a little a little ashamed of when I would say that I did not know, as a person who was college educated, Davon, had finished school, I did not know that Rosa Parks sitting at the front of the bus was an organized direct action.
Mhm.
It
Most
wasn't.
people don't know that.
I mean, I was like, I was in my 30s. I had gone to school. I was a Prince George's County public educator. I'd even gone to a couple of private schools in my time, and never have I ever been introduced to that. And I think it was in that moment of becoming politicized. In that moment, I was at a training, a week-long training at People's Action through Progressive Maryland, and I learned that. And it was in that moment that my worldview started to change. I said to myself, no, people, just don't need jobs. And Life After Release evolved from just an organization that was providing workforce development because I was a former federal government employee and I knew how to do KSAs. And I thought that my contribution to formerly incarcerated people would be to get them a job. And so it was in that moment that I changed and I understood that we have systemic root causes that shape our world for Black people. And it was that forever changed, politicized, and changed me and set me on the trajectory and changed the mission of my organization to what it is today.
Yeah. No, that's a really good segue, because as we're when you think about how an organization or individual chooses to operate, their worldview guides then the kinds of political activity that they're going to engage in. And so, if you can tell the listeners, like, what are examples of some of the work that you've done? You mentioned Life After Release, which that's the work that I'm most familiar with you, and in observing. Can you talk about what are some of the things that you've done in that capacity and others, to successfully challenge white supremacy and our Black people?
Yes, and I remember it like it was yesterday. It was through, I needed money, so I worked with Progressive Maryland, and they asked me to endorse or to help them with the endorsement process for a prosecutor. And I said to myself, I said, well, what do you mean help you to endorse? You know, um, they were like, yeah, we want to pick a progressive prosecutor. Now, that was the time where progressive prosecutors were the thing, and everybody across the country was into progressive prosecutors. And I pushed back and I said, I don't believe any prosecutor can be progressive, and they were like, well, let's just endorse one anyway. And so I pushed back again and I said, well, can we discuss this with some facts? How do you know? Are there any reports that we can pull? We looked online, we looked at the courthouse reports. There's nothing that you can pull that says whether or not a prosecutor is doing a what a prosecutor is doing in order to be able to call them progressive or not. And so I withheld and said, I will not help you all to create an endorsement process for a progressive prosecutor unless and until we figure out what you all, I know what a prosecutor does. At that point, I was an impacted woman. So I knew what a prosecutor did, scared me, right? Scared the hell out of me. And so it was my lived experience connected to this organization who was just trying to do what they were doing across the country. And it was noble, I mean, an idea, but to endorse a progressive prosecutor and not have a mechanism to identify what a prosecutor does, to me, didn't feel like it was something I could do, nor was it justified. And so in that moment, Larry Stratford and I, we had several conversations. We brought in a Color of Change and a lot of other organizations. And what was birthed from that was court watching. And court watching was something that it started off as a small project that we did. Color of Change, CRC, and a few other national orgs, ACLU, and a few other national orgs came in to help create the structure for this court watching program so that we could identify and introduce to community exactly what prosecutors did and how they did what they do. And so it was that programming based on that kind of introduced me to shape the world that I live in currently, which is uh, legal empowerment. Legal defense, legal empowerment is a place where I personally bring my expertise as an impacted woman, and it has to do with everything courts, prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, and also helping our loved ones be able to navigate the criminal legal system. And I think that it's a very small lane of people that do that type of work, but it's very impactful. We have been able to save, working with our people in community, through our court support, court watching, and participatory defense, over 70 individuals. We have been able to save almost 5,000 years of incarceration. I don't know if that lands with folks, but we were able to 70 people that were facing 5,000 years incarcerated, Black people, Prince George's County, that our organization was able to help do through this participatory defense and legal empowerment work that we do and champion.
Yeah, I mean that's dope. I mean, one of the things that our listeners will be familiar with is a central part of our analysis as to why, like, we focus a lot on the impacts of the criminal justice system is because of the way that notions of inherent criminality, right, justify the kinds of policies that track so many of our people into the system, and prosecutors is one of those positions where there's so little structured oversight of how they operate and the decisions that they make. So I think Court Watch and that innovation is an extremely important, impactful mechanism of holding prosecutors accountable in a way that I'm sure many of them, aren't used to. And so that segues to the next question, because an issue like criminal justice reform, and just the way that policies that try to undo the harm that's been done to our community through that system get such strong pushback from the law enforcement establishment, FOP, Maryland States Attorneys Association, the Maryland Association of Police Chiefs and Sheriffs. Like the law enforcement establishment pushes really hard against any of the kind of proposals that you or I will put forward. And a big part of what's behind that is that in the society structure of racism and white supremacy, there are white liberals and white moderates that have anxieties, quite frankly, about Black folks who are most impacted, by that system, right? There's kind of an inherent set of anxieties and fears that I think, unfortunately, the mainstream elements of the Democratic Party have capitulated, right? And trying to appease, a white suburban voter that would be scared of the very people who we would want to support and help. Um, and that is at odds with, I think, folks in our community, right, who don't feel like there's enough being done in addressing a lot of the issues that exist in our community that specifically impact Black people. So, so my next question is, what is your message? That base of people who have anxieties about moving the kinds of policies that we know are important for our community. What is your message to that constituency? And then what is your message to the constituency in our community that want Black folks in elected office to be more bold and militant in their advocacy for folks in our community?
Very good question. And I think I've lived that evolution. When I came home, I was so angry, Davon. I was so angry. I was a I guess middle aged Black woman who had never been in any trouble before, and had never been charged or anything like that, and subsequently did 2.5 years and came home. I was upset, and it showed up in a lot of protesting, a lot of marches, a lot of people would call me at the time very a rebel. I heard some people calling me rebel, a lot of things. And I think that exactly what you're saying is what I lived. Um, my responsibility now that I've learned is to lead with honesty, accountability, and courage, understanding that the world that I want to build for our people is not here yet, right? And living in the here and now, and how to do that in a way that doesn't compromise my personal values of the way that I feel about our current system. And that was something that I had to sit with for a while. And to the people who feel anxious about the criminal justice reform, I would say that it's not only white people. I think a lot of people get caught up in the fact that it's only white people that are anxious. No, it's actually our people, a lot of our Black people who are very anxious about it. I've been, people have been on the internet talking about the ways in which they don't feel that I should be elected into position because of their anxiousness, right? And what I would have to, even though I've come home and graduated with a degree in legal studies and a minor in public safety, there are still people who do not believe or who are not comfortable with that. And what I would have to say is that accountability and public safety are not in conflict at all. It is, we have to operate within fairness, transparency, and dignity. And our communities will be stronger because of that. And so I think that we have to get in the room And we can't just keep talking to people who feel the way that you and I feel. And I think that's another way that people are a little anxious about it. Understanding that the system is is rooted in harm, right? And it's not what you see on TV. I thought that when when I was going through my case that it was going to be like Law and Order. I honestly thought that as an adult, right? That I thought you know, my only example of the legal system was Law and Order, Judge Judy, all of the shows on TV that show and teach me, how to be in community with law enforcement and the legal system. And it's nothing like that. And so we have to start to be in the table with our people. That are making the decisions. And I think where we often fall short, and this is going into now, our people, Black people who feel as though elected officials should be militant, right, in their advocacy and, in fighting in a way that is, it's not going to look like a protest when you're an elected official, right? Because at the end of the day, I have to still, or elected officials um, still have to be conscious of the community as a whole, everyone, right? Even though my worldview and my understanding of the world is through a Black woman, through an oppressed Black woman, I still have to see the world and operate as for the collective, with the understanding that when you free Black people, you free everyone, right? And so, to Black people and to people who feel like folks are selling out that become elected officials, folks are we can't get the agenda done when folks go into the office. I strongly disagree, and I'm going to see if how that works out through my election, and understanding that you have to continue to be at the table. My brother in Louisiana is a prime example of that, right? Calvin Duncan has run for and won by 68% of the vote to be the clerk of the criminal courts in Louisiana. And by God, I mean, you would think that the heavens have come down. They have really stopped through legislation, now through the courts, stopping his appointment. And so what I'm saying to folks is that if that is, you feel like you're called to go into elected office, you have to work for all the people without compromising your personal worldviews, if that makes any sense, or landing with folks at all.
Got you. No, that's helpful. That's helpful. And I think, one of the things that, will be extremely important is, who we see as our base, right? That if the base of our support are those that are most directly impacted by these systems, then we see them as a source of our power, right? And that power can allow us to move policy that can be beneficial to our community. And so, and actually, that's a good segue to a last aspect of our conversation. I imagine that a lot of people listening to this don't know what a clerk of the court is or what a clerk of the court does. So, if you can say, a bit about like what is a clerk of the court, what's the importance of it, and also as a person, you described yourself as a person committed to Black liberation. What is the way that you would use this position? Should you be elected? How would you use your position as clerk of the court in a way that's specifically beneficial to our community?
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for that question. And I feel like I've already won in my election, right? Getting into the elected office is going to be a bonus to that win that I'm already in. I am a Black woman impacted by the system that is on the ballot. That right there, hands down, is already a win. Understanding that. That's a win for me is very important, because of my lived experience, and because when I sat down and I thought about this for a long time. Running for this position is not something that I did that would happen within the last year. I've actually been contemplating this since for almost 8 years now. I just wasn't brave, and I went through stages. right? I would go back and forth with it. The first stage was I don't want to be a part of that system that put me away. I don't want to be a part of it later for them. I'm just going to be out on the sidelines protesting and doing what I do. And then I would sit and think, maybe I do want to be in there because, I actually spent 6 months longer incarcerated because there was a clerical error in my paperwork when I was incarcerated. I don't. It's so difficult to even to kind of talk about, and the fact that it happens all the time. And they're like, people are like, six. That's half a year, 6 months, because the clerk in the records department had this back and forth about the difference between consecutive and concurrent. And because one of the judges in my case had taken completely all of her time back, when you go in to recalculate that time, it is then left on the clerk, right, to input that properly into the system. And so that goes into what a clerk's job is. And the clerks to me are the gatekeepers of justice. They are the administrators of justice. They are the record keepers of justice. And most people would think a piece of paper is not that important. But if you think about it, warrants are written on paper, motions are written on paper, and it is the job of the clerk to manage these functions within our court system to make sure that they're operating completely and thoroughly. And so for me, and also to help individuals navigate the criminal legal system as well as the legal system in and of itself. We're talking about custody cases. We're talking about child support. We're talking about, uh, any type of motions that you have to file, divorce hearings, if you get married, all land records, all of these things happen within the courts. And before I started running for this position, a lot of people in Prince George's County really kind of slept on this position. So again, I'm already winning because now there is a active conversation happening in our county about the courts, and that makes me happy because now people are seeing and talking about it, and so now they even know what and who to hold accountable. And before I entered into this race, that hadn't been a reality. And so I'm very happy. And like I said, I believe that I've already won in a lot of aspects when it comes to this. And the last thing that I'll say is that when I came home, I also had to navigate the courts for my dad. This is civil, right? We have civil parts of the court and we have criminal parts of the courts, both of which I've had to navigate. And so when I came home, my father was a vegetable. He had a blood clots in his legs after having prostate cancer and surgery. And those blood clots released. One went to each lung and one went to his brain. And so my dad stayed in a nursing home for 4 years. So what does that have to do with the courts? I'm glad you asked. What it has to do with the courts was I had to help navigate. My father had an estranged wife, who he was in the process of getting a divorce for, which is also happens in the courts. He was getting a divorce from her, and he got sick and he wasn't able to speak for himself. My father was a veteran. My father did not have a registered will. And so his wife, I had to fight her. I had to litigate with her pro se because I did not have money in the courts for 4 years to be able to get what was rightfully mine for me and my siblings because she didn't have any kids with my dad. She was his fifth wife, and it took me 4 years until his passing to be able to navigate, to be able to get what was owed for me and my siblings. And what that looked like was my father passed away with almost $300,000 in the bank because he was a veteran. He received veteran money, and she would have gotten all of that had I not been able to get a guardianship in place for him while he was sick through the courts, to be able to say no and have her relinquish his credit cards, his bank accounts, and everything, and put it in a safe escrow in the courts until his passing. And then the law is in the state of Maryland, if you die without a will, and you're married, your spouse gets the first 50% of your assets, and the remaining 50% is then divided amongst your dependents. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that in the state of Maryland, if you have a background, you're not allowed to be an executor of an estate. something that now we're talking about legislation, and I'm not new to legislation. I just helped pass the jury bill this session. I would also be using that leverage to get into the courts to change some of the systemic ways that a lot of people don't know about, to be able to open up the doors of justice for our people, whether it's civilly or criminally.
Is there anything else that you want to tell people, particularly about what your agenda is? Like, should you, be elected into that particular seat to be clerk of the court of Prince George's County? Do you have a particular agenda? Do you have a particular initiatives that you want to, tell people about?
Absolutely. Was considered a 10 percenter. I did just write a book. It's called Lies, Alibis, and Plea Deals. You can find it on Amazon. And a lot in that book, I talk a lot about the criminal legal process. And I call myself a 10 percenter. Why? Because only 10% of individuals in this country actually go to trial, and the 90% take plea deals. And so, what I would like to do in my hidden agenda, if you would, is no, it's not hidden anymore, is to really beef up and to have a conversation about juries. And I feel like being a clerk of the court, I would have such a platform to be able to do that. We have, Davon, we have to talk to our people. I mean, we talk to our people about voting. And we've been doing that since Martin Luther King. We've been doing that for decades. And I think that for the most part, and particularly our elderly Black folks, they're getting to the polls, right? We're getting out and we're voting. However, when the jury notices come in the mail, I can almost guarantee you that those same people who skip down to the voting booth are skipping out on the jury box. And to me, those civic duties are equal in importance. However, we as a people, we as frontline advocates and people who believe in justice, we have left that area completely untouched. And so I'll also work with an organization called the Jury Project in Louisiana, if folks want to look that up. But we have to start to talk about that. And that, if you would, in addition to connecting the community to the courts in many ways, because in Prince George's County, our courthouse receives over 100,000 people a month. It is the most visited agency in our county. That's a lot of people every month. And so being able to connect them to resources and connect them to different things that are happening in the community, but also an awareness campaign of how important it is to actually go to jury duty, and then in my part of legislation, to start to talk about what is a jury of our peers, how much are jurors getting paid, and access to jury duty. So that's my hidden agenda, if you would.
Mhm. And I imagine that, in some ways it probably goes without saying, the importance of folks in our community serving on juries is to ensure that folks get a fair trial. That's my assumption. I just want to make sure, like, land the plane in terms of why, like, more of our people engaging in jury service is important, specifically to Black people.
Yes, fair trial, you fair outcomes, yes. And also, Davon, your lived experience and my lived experience, we understand. So we can reach a true verdict through our lived experience and understanding. Whereas, someone who may not be from the neighborhoods that we're from may not understand. I'll give you a prime example. There was an individual who we helped with their case, who had a very large sum. Had a very large sum of drugs, of some type of drugs, and they were charging this individual with distribution. Of course, this person was Black, right? And what what we understood was that they were like, no, you all are charging him wrong. This person had a habit, and was a user and needed help. And so, but the prosecution was charging him with distribution, because they were like, he had a lot of drugs. There was no way that this person could just be using the drugs. And what had happened was, this person had come into a large inheritance from a family member and just bought a lot of drugs for their own personal use. And so we were able to articulate that, and someone on a jury who may have addiction, or from that, a peer of a person an addiction would understand and be able to fight back to say, no, you all are charging this person inappropriately and not getting this person the help that they need, which is substance abuse support, rather than locking them up for distribution. And so when I say even a fairer trial, what we're also talking about is support, help, pushing back on the system, because now you have people with lived experience sitting on a jury. You have people who are, from these communities sitting on a jury. And so I wanted to just flesh that out a little bit more. It's more than just a fair trial. It is actually being able to understand that person who's sitting at the defendant's table.
Yeah. Well, look, Keon, I appreciate you making the time to talk to us. Looking forward to doing what we can, so that people hear what you have to say and hear your platform. I think it's important for people with your experience, both personal, but also professional. Like the work that you do is important. And so we're hopeful that this what you said through the course of this program is something that will inform how people, when they go to the ballot box, the decisions they make there. So I appreciate you for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and for being in community with me and for doing all that you do. You are a frontline representative of justice, and I appreciate you.